decades-old conflict, a long-awaited request for recognition granted, and now the world waits. For more on what Palestine's new status means for geopolitics, we're joined by Janice Stein, TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst, Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the U of T. Welcome back, Janice. Nice to see you again.
Steve.
Well, it's a big day. Non-member observer state. That's what Palestine has been granted by an overwhelming vote of the UN. What does that mean, non-member observer state?
Well, a little bit less than a state, but more than observer status, which is what Palestine had before. Putting those two together, non-observer state, gives Palestine new rights. Principally, it can join the specialized agencies of the United Nations, which it could not do before. And the one that is in the news, of course, it is now legally possible for Palestine to apply to become a member of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and then it would have access to the court.
So that's clearly more than symbolic. That's a real thing.
That is more than symbolic. So anyone who says this is purely symbolic is wrong. It is very important symbolically, and you saw last night in Ramallah the celebrations. So it does matter, but it is more than symbolic.
How do you evaluate those celebrations? Because I noticed in a lot of the coverage, those celebrations were described as the government gave everybody the day off from work and were encouraged to get out there. And so, like, how spontaneous was all that really?
Well, it's interesting because I think they were real, let me put it this way, in Ramallah. We're coming off a hard 2 weeks, Steve. It was a war in Gaza. Foreign ministers from Qatar, Turkey were in Gaza City expressing solidarity with Hamas. And Abbas and the PLO and Fatah marginalized in Ramallah, receiving almost no international attention. So the move at the United Nations, which was long planned, nevertheless was very important for West Bankers. And in that sense, you saw that in the streets last night.
As you evaluate this, is it really a significant step towards Palestine becoming a state like any other?
Does this, let me rephrase the question, does this recognition at the UN unlock the process of deadlock negotiations between Israel and Palestine? No. It probably, if anything, does the reverse, because as you said in the introduction, Israel opposed this so strongly.
Well, but the premise underneath that answer is that there's no statehood without Israel's say-so.
Well, that's really the issue, that, as Palestinians on the ground in Ramallah are saying, this is a great night, but what's going to change tomorrow morning? And not much. Facts on the ground, the way of life isn't really going to change. That has to be negotiated. In terms of borders, lifting of checkpoints, access to water, all the things that contiguous territory, all the things that refugees, all the things that really matter to Palestinians can only be achieved through a negotiated process with Israel. And that process has been frozen for more than 2 years.
More on that in a bit, but you used the word contiguous there, and let's pick up on that, because of course Palestine today does not have contiguity, right? It is West Bank and Gaza, and they don't touch.
Right.
So, all of what transpired at the UN yesterday, does it go for both of those territories?
Well, that's an issue too. By the way, contiguous territory, when I used it, I was actually thinking about the West Bank, that it is so fragmented now.
I see.
So that's an issue in the West Bank, but it's also an issue between Gaza and the West Bank. You know, Hamas has had a very interesting position on this. Its longstanding position has been to oppose this move at the UN because the resolution says 2 states, or the state of Palestine, within the borders of 1967. Hamas has opposed that implicit recognition of Israel. After the war, it moved and it said it supported the resolution that Abbas was putting forward. But yesterday in interviews again, it pulled back. So when you look at that, you have to say that a unified Palestinian delegation, which will ultimately be necessary for any negotiation, That's not yet visible. We can't really see that happening yet.
Well, that's a good point, because Abbas was there, obviously, for the UN vote, but Hamas
was not. And not only were they not there, which one could understand, because, in the past, the discussions between Hamas and Abbas have been like this, Steve, that Hamas would allow Abbas to represent all of Palestine, would not insist on the foreign policy file, in other words, but there were significant positions that Hamas objected to. You can't really move this forward if Hamas is still saying, we do not recognize the state of Israel, we are entitled to all of Palestine.
All of what was Palestine in 1948.
Right.
Okay.
And yesterday, Haniya of Hamas, the prime minister, reiterated that statement again. So there's still a significant gap between these two wings of the Palestinian movement.
Okay. As we try to put yesterday's decision into some kind of historical context, would you say that it was comparable to the vote that took place in the United Nations in 1948
yes.
to create the State of Israel?
That vote recommended that historic Palestine, which was under British rule, be divided into a Jewish and an Arab state.
And that's the 47 vote. I'm
yes.
talking about the 48 vote where Israel declared its independence. Is this comparable to that?
Well, it's actually the 47 vote, because that's what happened at the UN. In 48, Ben-Gurion actually did a UDI, a Unilateral Declaration of Independence. So the real comparison's to the 47 vote.
Which was 65 years to the day earlier.
65 years to the day earlier. And that vote, it is, because that vote did not say anything about how it was going to happen. It just said it should happen. And then, frankly, all hell broke loose and there was a terrible war afterwards. This resolution says this should happen. Doesn't tell us very much about how it should happen. So all the disagreements that there are on the ground are still there, but there's a legitimating resolution, which is what was so important to Abbas and which Israel opposed so forcefully.
So in that respect, it is comparable to the 47 partition plan vote?
Yes.
Okay. Let's just look at this here. 138 votes in favor, 41 abstentions.
Right.
Including some pretty big countries.
Yes.
The UK, Germany was on that list, and 9 against. And I want to focus on 3 of the 9. First, Israel. They voted against, saying the road to statehood lies in direct negotiations between Jerusalem and Ramallah. But there haven't really been any substantial direct negotiations in a very long time. So is this position disingenuous?
The fact that negotiations have been deadlocked and really haven't made much progress makes that argument a much tougher one. Now, the real issue is, and here we get into he said, she said kinds of arguments, which have been going on for 60 years. Why haven't there been negotiations? President Obama asked for a settlement freeze. Israel agreed. That freeze lasted 10 months. The negotiations only started in the 9th month. And then
the freeze came off.
After the freeze came
when
off.
Biden was there.
Exactly. Israel wouldn't agree to renew it, and Abbas wouldn't agree to any negotiations without a renewal of the freeze. So Israel holds Abbas responsible for the deadlock. Abbas holds Israel responsible. But certainly, I think it's fair to say, Steve, that the road to actual statehood is through negotiations. And that's fundamentally the position that Israel, the United States, and Canada all took. If you heard Ambassador Susan Rice in her comments about the vote, it really was, if we're going to change the facts on the ground, you have to have a diplomatic process.
So is that a set? Okay, I mentioned 3 countries. That's Israel's explanation why they voted no. The American explanation for why they voted no, same deal?
Same deal.
And Canada too?
Yep, absolutely same deal. John Baird went down to the UN yesterday, Foreign Minister of Canada, and fundamentally it's the same set of arguments. I think Canada made those arguments a little more forcefully than the United States did. Hillary Clinton was not. At the UN General UN General Assembly, our foreign minister was. But fundamentally, the arguments are all the same, that the resolution to this conflict has to come through a negotiated process. It's not going to happen otherwise. You know, it's interesting because having heard Hamas so forcefully over these last 2 weeks, their position is we'll agree to a long truce, a 60-year truce. But that does not include an end to the conflict. That does not include recognition. So that's really where the area of contestation lies.
You know, I can imagine people having this kind of a conversation related to John Baird's speech, which, as you point out, is pretty unusual for Canada to send its foreign minister to the UN to get up there and give a speech in front of the whole world. I can imagine people saying, would it have killed John Baird just to say a couple of nice things about the significance of this day? Because in tone, the speech was very strongly opposed to what took place. Would it have killed him so much to say something nice about this?
You know, it was strong, and our Prime Minister, who didn't go to the UN General Assembly, nevertheless made time to go and meet with Abbas in New York and to warn him against the consequences of doing this. So that's a very, very strong position. Now, when you ask officials why our government has taken this strong position, what you get back over and over again, Steve, is this a principled position. This argument is, this resolution, in fact, is about the delegitimating Israel, and that's a position that this government simply will not accept. So they are framing it largely within the perspective of a principled argument. That's not the view of many others.
Right. Should the government of Canada be concerned about the fact that, again, as you look at that vote, 138 for, 9 against, do they want to be that isolated in the world?
Well, you know, that's what's all. And by the way, we've called back our ambassador to Israel and our diplomatic representative in Ramallah for consultations. They are coming back today for consultations that will take place over the next 2 or 3 days, really.
Which means what, really?
Really to consider what, if anything, Canada's next step is.
So it's not we're bringing you home out of protest or anger,
no.
It's to consult.
It's to consult, but usually when you bring your diplomatic representatives back like this, it does mean there will be some next step forthcoming. You don't usually bring them home to say nothing when the consultation process is over.
But should we be worried about being this isolated?
Well, you know, to come back, one of the things our Prime Minister, and I think this is very much in his DNA actually, has said over and over, he's not worried about whether he's with the majority or and not only on this issue. So this is not unique to this issue. He's not worried about whether he's with the majority, whether he's with the minority, whether he agrees with traditional allies or he doesn't.
No, he feels he's right. And when he feels he's right, he's going to stick to it.
That's exactly right. And that's what you see here, frankly, Steve.
Okay, let's in our remaining moments here talk about the consequences of this vote. Do you think it will help reconcile the differences among the two Palestinian leaderships now in Gaza and West Bank?
It certainly is helpful to Abbas, who is marginalized by the war. You know, Palestinians living in the West Bank, and they're actually the crucial voters here, although there's been no election in Palestine since 2007. But they're the crucial players. Looked at all the international attention that Hamas was getting, saw the foreign minister of Qatar, of Turkey, the prime minister of Egypt come and visit. And really, what you read and heard in the newspapers was, well, diplomacy really isn't working. There's no benefit. Force is what works. When you see the overwhelming support that Abbas was able to get at the UN, that I think is helpful, is persuasive to his own people. That there is a role for diplomacy here. And that's an important argument to make in this part of the world.
Because he was descending into irrelevancy for a while.
He really was.
Wasn't
he was being marginalized in a very serious way.
Okay. Question 2. Will this vote create momentum for the resumption of direct talks between Israel and the Palestinian Authority?
I don't see it. Having just come back from this part of the world, I don't see it. Largely because, Steve, the divisions between Hamas and Fatah are deep. And the track that Hamas is going down now is not one really which provides much incentive. The key here is going to be Egypt and President Morsi. He was crucial in negotiating that ceasefire, and part of his agenda very, very much is to push these two to come together and create a unified delegation. Mubarak couldn't do it. Let's see what Morsi, who's much closer to Hamas, can do. So that the ball is in his court.
Can you imagine Morsi trying to be influential with Hamas to participate in negotiations?
Oh, yeah.
You can.
Oh, yeah.
Huh.
Oh, yeah. There's no question about that. I mean, and that's what's so interesting about what happened in this last 2 weeks. He pushed for that ceasefire very hard. He does not want the relationship destabilized with Israel.
Okay, but a ceasefire is one thing. To recognize and negotiate with somebody you've sworn to push into the sea and don't recognize is another thing,
Well,
isn't it?
Morsi hasn't sworn to do that.
No, but Hamas has.
Yes, but Hamas is much more dependent on Egypt than Fatah is. Morsi has traction with Hamas. I would not be surprised to see him push very hard, but that's going to take time.
So in the last 20 seconds, bottom line is yesterday's vote may not have moved the case of peace forward. It's still in the president of Egypt's hands.
Yes, it is.
That was very succinct. Janice Stein from the Monk School, thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.